Yeah, that's this week too. Big part of it is I'm just in class time. Yeah. Question, I guess. Do deer runs kill trees?
They can. Yeah, yeah, it's kind of like grilling half the tree. So they can kill it directly if it's a small enough tree. They also, it's a wound, so it's open pathogens can work their way in. Yeah. Christmas tree farms hate deer. Many reasons. One is tree mortality from just bugs. They don't get eaten like other trees do.
After that lecture about there, breaks do quite a bit of damage. So.
Yeah, yeah, they can definitely do it. Kill a bunch of trees. They've designed some really interesting guards, tree guards, like basically taking rebar and like Christmas tree, crossing it over and sticking it next to the tree so they can't get their antlers up to the tree. It's a big enough problem in some places.
Not
Not sitting over
No.
there.
Didn't check that out there.
Made it through one class, it's not gonna be two.
Yeah. Taylor, you want to stick around for the announcements real quick? Taylor, you want to stick around for the announcements? Anyway. Everybody have a good break? Man, glad to be back. Kinda. All right, so we're coming to the end of the semester, which I'm sure you all are very aware of. Today's gonna be your last lecture, true lecture. All right, we're gonna do 2 topics in one. Most of that, you have your lab test next Tuesday, right? So today's last lab. Make sure we have time to set up and give you guys time to deal with the test. We're just not gonna have class next Tuesday, which means if you want a review session for the last test, that'll have to be this Thursday. So we're just gonna mind everything. So today will be the last lecture. We'll confuse it. I know, right? Yeah, just went just flying by. So they're gonna leave. So that's kind of, I'm gonna try Thursday. I will have your test and we can look at those because today's lecture is gonna be long. We're not gonna go that back. So you'll have a chance to see how you did. Math is complicated, I guess. Cause panic for the most part. And then your last test, I think it's Tuesday the 17th at 10:30, if I remember correctly. That'll basically just be 5 lectures. yeah, 5 lectures. The amount of content's lower, still worth 100 points. There will not be any math on it. So, yeah, probably just be short answers, those kind of things. But I will put together a little study test again for you. The evaluations for the class should be open. Since this is the first time I'm teaching it, I ask that you provide feedback. If you hate it, that's fine. Please be constructive so I can try to make it better. Don't just say you hate lab. Please tell me what you would like to see different or what you actually didn't like in the lab. Or this, assume that like the math part was a little overwhelming.
When did you say the final was?
I think it's the 17th, the
So
Tuesday,
Friday?
or I'm sorry,
Thursday.
Thursday,
16?
16th.
Okay.
I'm pretty sure I posted it at one point when the final time was. I'll do that again.
Okay.
I thought it was Tuesday.
I think it's
Yeah, it's the 14th. Sorry, numbers are all screwed. Tuesday the 14th. It's Tuesday. I mean that, the date that was all.
Okay.
Is it gonna be in class again?
Here. Yes.
In 2 hours?
It will not take you 2 hours. It will not take you 2 hours. It will be the same length as the previous test without the math. So just think like how long it took you the first test. Most of you, I think, we're done in about 45 minutes. Okay.
And it starts at 11?
Yes, I think so. I think it's what, the 11 to 1.
I just have
slot.
it being in class, so I don't know.
I will send out an announcement once I have it all straight. Yeah, if it's not, yeah.
The announcement you sent out is at 10:30 to 12:30, 12:14.
That's pulled straight off of the final schedule, off of it, so that's when it is. Good? Your problem?
Forestry 37 or 340 is 8 to 10 a.m. So that's the only thing I was like making sure they don't overlap. Because there's multiple of us that have that overlapping class.
Yes, I know. So,
But they don't overlap. There's just
no, if they're
regular-
just following the regular final schedule, they can't overlap. And I would imagine Dr. Cox would not allow that to happen. But yeah, that's a lot. in one day. It's a lot of wildlife in one day. You know? The other thing I wanted to ask, because there's not really a tool for it, recognizing the issues with the lab. One of the things that I was looking at in terms of changing the class, and I want to get a gauge on whether or not you all will be interested in this as a student, was trying to do a weekend down at Robinson Forest, which is our experimental forest, 2 hours away, where instead of just learning about like mark recapture, we would go out and do things like flipping tin, looking for herps and marking them, or going and doing small mammal trapping and marking them, so that you could actually work up and see how we actually catch wildlife, but also then learn the mark recapture stuff, population estimate techniques out in the field instead of. The thing is, a weekend down there, it costs about $15 a night to stay there, which is our reduced UK rate. On top of food is about $27 a day. Now they cook for you and everything, and it's bunkhouse. So a weekend down there would be about $100. The fee for this class is $50. I'm somewhat limited, I understand, in terms of raising that, so I wouldn't be able to find a way of paying for it. Would you all think that would be worth $100 to do that, if your money? And then if you were asked to pay the forest directly, which, so worth it, yes or no, hands up? Pay, yes or no? Yeah, kind of, okay.
By weekend at Robinson Forest, do you mean one night or 2 nights?
I mean, go down Friday afternoon, stay Friday, put out traps Friday night, check traps Saturday morning, check traps again Saturday, or place traps Saturday night, check traps Sunday morning, and be headed back Sunday afternoon.
Okay.
Because we gotta do 2 capture events to mark the capture.
Yes, so
Right.
one overnight, so would not sound like $2.
No, it's not, the fee is built,
Yeah,
the fee would be based on actual expenses, whatever it is.
Yeah,
You know, it's not like I'm making money off of this, it's whatever I
I
have to pay
know,
that.
I know.
So I wish I could do it for free, but anyways, travel would be kind of on your own. I have probably limited to 2 vans, so it'd be a little bit weird. We have more vans down there than you get there, but just getting down is a problem. Yeah.
Just a quick question. Why is it so complicated for you to do this when it's already a trip set up by like NRES? Does it?
So when they do it, it is in the summer.
I think they had another trip usually.
They do, they do the weekend trip to with Monty. It's, what's the fee for that class?
It's
So I
not
can't look at the
$100,
syllabus, I
but
can't look at the syllabus.
Yeah.
I tried to-
I think we're
But that's
limited to
only-
$50, so NRES actually eats up that cost in a way. So like we do the same thing with some of our forestry students, where we build in our budget with the department, how to instruction, how to cover that cost as an educational experience.
But that's to Mammoth Cave, not the Robinson.
Correct.
Course 3 of 7340.
So that's probably based on that. So I'd have to go through the process, and I was trying to figure out how to do that. I was being told no, no, no. So that's where I'm getting that. I was trying to find an end around. Yeah.
I would suggest making it an option outside of like forest registry.
It is going to have to be an option. So it would be an added component. It would
In
not
this
be-
class, you have to pay it no matter what, if you couldn't go, it's just.
Correct. So it would be an additional experience. Yeah. So not required, just an additional experience. Okay? You're good. Yeah, you can go outside as well.
Yeah, you kind of make it look fast. Thank you.
Yep, no problem. All right. Okay, so we are going to cover basically restoration, reclamation, and also present a little bit about some common issues and limitations we have in terms of management strategies for parks, whether it's national parks, state parks, local parks, where many of our tools are sometimes not there because of bureaucracy, because of human dimensions issues with neighbors, and so on. So just to kind of make you aware that they exist and how, you know, sometimes they're dealt with. This one's kind of a need to talk about. We are in Kentucky, we're in Appalachia, we have a long history of mining. And it's not the only place that happens, right? So we don't just leave and abandon these areas, hopefully, after they're done. We have to do some kind of restoration and reclamation to them to make them functioning as an ecosystem. So how you approach that is you kind of have to look at how that system would normally function. How is it currently functioning? What are the potential goals of the restoration event? And how do you get to those goals based on what you have left to work with? When you look at what you're left to work with, sometimes that's not much. It's not like that's soil, that's all rocks. Okay, you have a lot of slope, so you're going to have a lot of erosion issues. You have heavy equipment that's running on top of that for a long period of time, so you have soil compaction issues if you have any soil. So it's not exactly pristine, right? It's not even in great shape. It's not in good shape. It's in horrible shape. But there's been a lot of work done on how to at least bring it back to a better condition than what it was in. So part of the initial steps, so trying to get vegetation back on there is going to take time. And in that time, if you're trying to develop soil naturally through plant matter, you just need to make sure that anything that is developing or naturally occurring, or if it's placed there, is going to stay there. So the big thing you need to address pretty quickly is the slope problems and the associated erosion issues. Okay, so you have to look at what kind of slopes are you dealing with, what are potential ways of making the situation better, and this is the idea of terracing. Okay, and then how do you go about prepping that surface or implementing those ideas? And the goal is always to minimize the erosion and give the vegetation time to take hold. Once the vegetation's there, right? So slope, we have very steep hills that have trees on them and all kinds of other vegetation. It's not like the soil is disappearing at very fast rates, even with an extreme slope. Those roots hold it in place. So what we need to do is buy time to get roots there to keep it in place. Overall, though, when you're talking about any kind of steep slope, if you are dealing with lands that are already destroyed, you can do a few things right off the bat, potentially, if possible, and decrease slope to basically a little bit more manageable amount. So if you're dealing with any kind of hills that are basically straight up and down, if you could do something to get rid of that 30% or greater grade, then you're going to be winning in some way. Ideally, if you can get it below 20 or closer to 10, you're in a lot better shape. One of the things that tools that you can put in place in areas where you may not be able to deal with the slope on a large scale is this idea of terracing. You have a couple different ways of doing that. Mostly, though, you have some kind of bench that exists with the creation of channels or drainage routes that are a little bit more controlled, so that you're slowing down the water, potentially giving it an opportunity to actually soak into the ground, and limiting the overall amount of over surface movement you have. What that could look like, it depends. So if you have steeper gradients that are much more, the soils are less likely to be conducive to infiltration, you're going to have a lot more over surface flow. So you may implement things that are going to divert or slow water at a different rate than, say, something as a more absorptive soil. So you may end up just making these little mounds, okay, that are basically just slowing things down. They may be a little bit more absorptive. Usually this can happen in areas you have good soil remaining. So there's a lot of space that can suck up water. This is generally what we use a lot on logging jobs for the forestry kids, right? So you see when you do the logging roads, you see the benches and the little rolls, right? That's all for soil control. The steeper the grade and the less absorbent, you're going to have to put more extreme blocking or slow down events for that moisture, almost to the point where it may actually hold and pool the moisture in certain areas and not actually let it go down. Okay. So there's a couple different types of benching, which is what this is on the extreme level. And it depends. All of these, if you think about it, if you imagine a drop of water or rain event, how is that water going to deal with this type of topography? To some level, it's going to hold it. You're going to get enough moisture, and it's going to start working its way down. Generally, not at a quick pace, but a slightly slower one. If you go to a slightly sloping bench, you can deal with a little bit more moisture, speed, but it all depends on what you're working with. If you have, this is kind of the method for more problematic situations, with the extreme being here, where you're actually attempting to hold water like a pond on those benches so you don't get that erosion, right? Here, it's basically you got a pool. Once it gets to that height, it's gonna go over. Here, it's got a little bit more extreme height, and you're kind of creating these ponding situations. So really bad erosion situations, slightly better. What that can look like depends on a couple things. We do implement these, like I said, with the logging activities quite a bit in our best management practices to prevent erosion in that situation. But the rules are all related to that gradient, that slope gradient. When it comes to how those benches, terraces work. Large scale, you know, it can be huge, but a lot of times we're actually implementing these on smaller scale. If you look distance wise for this, say if this is a logging road on a fairly extreme slope, you're only dealing with about 1 meter to 2 meters-ish of space and a bench that's, you know, 1/3 of a meter, just to slow things down. And it's even less so, right, when you have a smaller slope, where you can actually even spread that impact out lengthwise, which is less disturbance than, say, making it deep on that slope. All right. Usually, though, you're taking this material and moving it to create that hump. Same. Okay. So what can that look like on a large scale? You can see multiple benches trying to slow things down. They eventually will give out over time if vegetation does not take hold. So it's important to be thinking about that. If you drive, you can really see this if you drive on any of the highways or roads in Southeast Kentucky. You will, in the cuts, you will see this kind of terracing that's there. And some of them, they've been there a while, you'll start seeing trees grow on them and whatnot. And that's basically a success, right? You bought the time, the vegetation's there, it's grabbing it. Now that vegetation is putting roots there and then pushing stones down into the road, which is the downside. But it's working for erosion control. Failures do happen. You all can see that you had some issues there. And it's one of those things where if you're not getting vegetation, you need to check on it and potentially rehab them. You can really see where it's fallen out through there and it's kind of failing. Over time, though, if you have, so this is, if I remember correctly, you go from there. Okay, success, right? You're starting to get some vegetation growth. You're achieving holding that soil there, and so on. And from the wildlife perspective, and why we care about this, is once you start getting vegetation, you start creating habitat and food, cover, and it becomes a functioning ecosystem for most of what we think of, right? So you're starting to get back to what, well, not what was there, but at least something that resembles a functioning ecosystem. All right. Now, stopping erosion is kind of the first step. You, especially in areas that don't have slope, you can start getting a little bit more aggressive on bringing vegetation and soil back. And there's a couple tools that you can use to help deal with some of that compaction, those compaction issues, the lack of surface soil for plants to grow on, to help move things along. The first one is a good one that we use for many things, but for restoration, basically what you're doing is creating a seed bed for plants to grow by going in and ripping up and disturbing the soil. You can do this in a couple different ways, but generally use heavy equipment, small scales. You can think of disking, or plowing the soil. All of that is scarification, okay? The restoration side, we're not, we don't usually see vegetation present. You're trying to create the soil there to prep the seed bed to get something going. We use it a lot in management to kind of reset things, okay? So it's also something we can do in the forest, we can do in grasslands. It's basically a disturbance event to start things over. The bigger problem that we generally face, especially in mine lands or other restoration situations, are soil compaction issues. If a soil is so compact, whether that's from heavy equipment or other things where there's no, basically there's no airless pockets in the soil, you can't get things, roots will not penetrate, plants will not grow, nutrients are not going to be able to move around in the soil, and so on. If that's the case, you have to do something about it. And there are a couple different things you can do. You can, right? So we see, especially here in the last couple of weeks, we saw folks aerating their lawns. That's what this basically is dealing with, is trying to deal with soil compaction issues in their lawns. Larger scale, you can do that with various equipment. Okay, but sometimes it requires a more aggressive situation. And this is doing something else to the soil, but the idea I'm trying to get along here before I talk about the next thing is a lot of times in mine lands, what we do, especially down in Robinson Forest, with Dr. Barton's work, is he actually has dozers come in that will rip up soil, cross rip it, and pull it up and basically create that aerated dirt, I don't want to call it soil, that allows for roots to at least get started. If they did not do that, it would just be hard surface that nothing could penetrate. No seeds would germinate in to get started. The roots wouldn't be able to go down. If they even start growing, all surface roots, as soon as the plants get large enough, they blow over. Okay, so it's a failure. So you have to create the soil characteristics with compaction that you need for those plants to have success. Okay, does that make sense? So what this is doing is kind of a similar step, but with soil that exists, and that's kind of hitting a restart with furrowing and gouging, where, sorry, you may have good soil present, but due to compaction issues, whether that's vehicles going over it consistently, we sometimes see it with cattle, with heavy cattle use areas where you have a lot of feet with weight, you get compaction problems. So if you're doing like a grassland restoration that is a pasture, you may try to loosen soil up in areas that were high use areas by animals, just to allow good aeration of the soil and give anything you're planting there a chance at growing. Okay. The next step here is kind of, if you really have the ability to jumpstart things and the funds to do so. I don't know how many of you garden, but buying topsoil and putting it into a garden, right? So you're looking at an investment for just a raised bed garden of $100 or so generally. Think of that at scale. How much does that cost? Because it is possible to bring in topsoil and get things going on for restoration. We did it on our property in Van Boeven down at Robinson Forest to get basically native grasses planted for cattle grazing. The idea was that mine land, if restored to native grasses or other grasses, could be used for cattle grazing to help supplement more space in Kentucky. Because we have 2.2 million cows. What's another 500,000? That was the hope. The cost was very prohibitive Because you're talking about potentially bringing in 12 inches of soil to put on top across large stretches. And that's most situations not feasible. It is effective. It's incredibly effective. It's just too costly to generally implement. You do speed up. I mean, you're speeding things up by decades. Yes,
Where do you get it?
comes from somewhere. Somewhere is losing soil. Yeah, I have no idea where all of it comes from. A lot of times, you know, we on a small scale, you know, a lot of the garden centers are selling compost mixed with other things and soil to amend it. But yeah, on a large scale, I have no idea where they brought all that in from. Because yeah, it's not like, it takes a while to create soil and large amounts of it. Yeah. Now, one of the things we are seeing is all the efforts that Dr. Barton has with green forest work. The amount of time it's taking to get those topsoil characteristics was actually a lot less than what we were expecting. Dr. Sina, who's over in the Honors College, they started seeing some of their tree plantings with the leaves that were hitting the ground. They're starting to see topsoil forming in like 15 to 20 years, where they were expecting it in like 40 or 50. So that's, as restoration and reclamation news goes, that's pretty big. That's a win. Most of the time we get losses. So, but yeah, I have no idea where it all comes from. Like at scale, I have no idea. A lot of times when they do reclamation, they're trying to bring it back, especially in flat areas where it might have been agriculture before, and they're trying to bring it back to agriculture. They have to ship in ridiculous amounts of topsoil so they can grow row crops, and they do. Much of southern Illinois is actually like that, where they brought in topsoil, probably from northern Illinois. So say you're lucky enough, or you are at a point where you actually have soil, then the big thing, right, is trying to keep it in place. And a lot of times that's get vegetation on it as quick as possible. That's what we see a lot of times with any kind of construction job. You see them putting hay mats out with grass, generally fescue seed, or the worst situation is they're putting Lesbodisa out, which is an invasive species, because it grows so fast. And it's an approved species to use, but it does grow fast. And the entire point of that is they're not thinking of wildlife or habitat conservation, they're thinking soil conservation. So you have to keep in mind that many of the things that we recommend, or I shouldn't say we recommend, agencies recommend for soil conservation don't necessarily work out for working up the chain. So fescue, Lesbodisa, all of that is great at keeping soil in place because it grows so fast, it grows incredibly dense, and it will keep soil in place. Getting rid of it and trying to get native plants back in there that generally grow slower and aren't as competitive with those is difficult. But if they're trying to keep soil in place, that's what they're going to use. But overall, when you're trying to get anything to grow, whether that's ground cover, whether it's native plants, and you're dealing with reclaimed areas or restored areas, you have to look at the soil you have present. Just like if you're farming, do a soil test, look for any deficiencies in nutrients and pH, whether it's acidic, basic, and then amend the soil as needed. So that could be liming it to reduce acidity. It could be adding fertilizer to get it to where it needs to be to support whatever plants you try to grow. And you know, the good thing about this is you see these recommendations here, blah, 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 blah. Well, the big thing is when you do a soil test, the results you get back tell you what exactly you need per acre. So these are just general rules of thumb. But you want to make sure you know what your soil is in terms of quality so you can get it to where it needs to be. The only way you're doing that is through a soil test. We do the same thing for, that picture sucks. Food plots, for wildlife, farmers do it for row crops, okay? Once you make the amendments to your soil and the soil is in good condition, then you can start thinking of how you're going to get seeds in the seed bed. Whether or not you disturb that soil depends on your situation, right? So what looks different on my screen is that this is a hill, right, and flat. You can do disturbance and soil disturbance to create better seed beds to make good seed to soil contact on flatter ground because you don't have erosion concerns. But if you're dealing with a hill, you're not going to want to do that because if you do anything to disturb that soil, you create the opportunity for erosion to happen. So you generally try to plant over top of the vegetation that's there and hope for the best in terms of germination. A lot of times you can use, if you're in the northern areas where you get freeze thaw events, that freeze and thawing actually will work seeds into the soil over time, like in winter, and it gets that soil contact there, right? Because expansion, contraction of soil, the seeds are sitting on top of it, they get into the cracks and work into the soil and you get better seed to soil contact. So doing a lot of seeding in the fall or winter gets you that better contact on those situations. All right. There are things like hydro seeding, which I'm sure you all are fairly aware of. You see them with a hose. It's usually a green solution that is got the seeds actually in the solution and basically just puts it wherever you need to, which would be a good application to a hill. The broadcast seeding, okay, so that's basically tractor with a spinning apparatus that is going to just throw seeds across whatever you're going through, okay? And then you get into the actual drill where you're putting seeds into the soil, which gets you the best seed to soil contact. However, you have to have soil that's in such condition that you can actually get a drill into. So you would not be able to get a drill into a mine that's filled with rocks. It would break your drill. It would work well with created seed beds, right? Works really well in row crop agriculture. That's what they use. But if you have a good seed bed where you have turned up dirt on a flat surface, broadcast seeding works just fine because that seed bed is prepped, seed lands on top, it's already contacting the dirt. You get some rain and it's good to go and it's germinating. This is the spraying your hill. Okay. Coming up with seed mixtures. Any of you had agronomy at all? No. Okay. So there's this idea that you need to be aware of when you're coming up with the amount of seed you're going to apply to per acre, whatever rate you're applying. And that's this understanding that not all seed that you have is going to be able to be germinating. Some of it's dead. So they come up with estimates of the amount of viable seed within the package you bought. Okay. It all comes down to is when you do an application rate, you want to make sure that you're calculating out the amount of good viable seed you have on the acreage you're applying it to, and that's the rate you need to use. It may say 60 pounds of clover per acre, which is not legitimate. It's like 3 pounds of clover per acre. And the clover seed's 90% viable. So you would basically divide the 3 pounds to, you may actually need to apply 3.1 pounds to get your 100% viable seed application. All right. If you were doing this for wildlife restoration or habitat restoration in general, how you decide what you're going to plant can be difficult. but the general rule of thumb is usually you want to focus on a mixture that's going to have a little bit of everything. Some annual plants that are going to grow quickly and grab soil. Your perennials that are going to take a little longer to get established, but will last longer over time. And then you have legumes. Why would you throw legumes in a bad soil? Foresters. Fix nitrogen. Yep. So you're improving soil quality. So you're what you're basically doing is quickly stabilizing the area, long-term health, better soil quality. If all of these are native, then you're also getting probably food cover quickly to some level, shape, or form. Okay. To give you an idea of what used to be recommended within the state, I don't even think Fish and Wildlife actually does this anymore. But for cost comparison, so you understand why folks, when it's non-conservation minded folks are doing restoration and what they choose. So this is a typical mixture that is approved. This is one that's kind of recommended for more wildlife related habitat. So you basically have fescue, the scourge of Kentucky in many ways, that's used because it grows so dense. It also can be used as forage. Lesbedisa, the non-native variety, and perennial ryegrass. Overall, per acre, you're looking at about $97 to apply and grab that soil. That is incredibly effective at doing so. The reason, even though this is cheaper at $35, this fails a ton because our native species just aren't as hardy at taking over. They are competing against a lot of other things. And even with some of the less invasive species that are in there, right? Different Lesbedisa, just a non-native or non-invasive version. The establishment is a problem. And why that matters is a lot of the folks, they have bonds that they're held to whenever they do development or mining. And to get that bond money back, they have to meet certain check marks and certain boxes for restoration and soil conservation. This guarantees that box to be checked. This does not. So they may have to reapply 2 or 3 or 4 times to get the coverage that they need, all while being fined each time they get visited to get checked on to see because they're losing soil. So even though per acre it's about half the cost, application time and problems associated with it cause a problem. So they tend to go with the I only have to go out there once to get it on and in place versus the other mixture. So economics, it really comes down to economics a lot. When this actually gets applied, also, it's not like you can go out there at any point in time in the year and put this in place. Generally, restoration and vegetation plantings are going to happen in early spring, when hopefully before the plants come out of dormancy, so that they immediately hit a growing season and can take hold. Or you get them and plant them at the end of a growing season when they're going into dormancy, so that their overwinter survival is there and they're already in place to grow in the spring. That generally is the rule for almost all, whether it's trees, forbs, grasses, and so on. The big thing is if you try to plant mid-growing season, especially with like trees, bushes, shrubs, you're disturbing them more, nutrient flow is a problem, your survival's low. Okay. The next, so you may have large stretches that you're trying to restore. the question usually comes up, do you want to wait for things to start happening naturally through successions, building soils, or do you want to try to speed things up? And that may come down to money, and it usually does. This takes time. It's kind of, right? So you're looking at, you may have some grasses growing here. It's basically a useless space for wildlife concerns until you start getting more diversity of species, plant species there, established, producing food and cover. So can you speed that process up where you may be able to jump to a later version by doing things like planting trees or shrubs? And the answer, as I already kind of talked about, is yes, you can. It may take a lot of money and time to get them in, so upfront costs, but you can speed it up. And you can also shift things to species that you want to be present in the landscape by choosing what you plant. Okay, so even this is what a lot of our tree plantings look like in terms of soil quality when they go in. But the entire idea is, as leaves fall off, they're going to build that rich soil that we need for many other species. So is it worth it? Well, it depends. But usually if you can afford it, it is. It'll speed the process up. And you immediately start getting structural cover, potentially food for many of the wildlife species that could use that area. So if you're going to do a tree or shrub planting, there are concerns as they are with everything else in terms of slope, what kind of habitat land you're in, a lot of restoration events, especially for reclamation, mine reclamation, is in traditionally bottomland forest habitat, especially in Western Kentucky. So upland forest species composition is different. So you need to make sure that you are planting species that should thrive in the area you put them in. And there's various spacing patterns, stem densities, and so on that you need to be aware of. In terms of costs for things like, if you're doing production, forestry, wildlife, habitat, or somewhere in between, you see there's a little difference in terms of what you can afford, how quick you can put it in, right? Acres reclaimed per day, forestry option, you get a lot less because you're making sure that those trees are going to survive, where you start looking at what can you get done and how quick can it get done. And there's an economic component here, long-term, right? You're putting trees in that you're planning on harvesting, and therefore it's kind of overhead cost with the overall goal that you're going to get more out of it economically if you have a higher survival, better tree survival long-term. You can also choose different spacing depending on your goals. This kind of structure is a little bit easier to manage, especially if you need to do herbicide treatments or mowing to potentially increase survival, right? However, from a wildlife perspective, you're creating these very open lanes that does not provide a lot of cover from predators for prey species. So you can do this diagonal fashion, which in some ways creates obscurity in at least one direction, but you still have these visual lanes here, right? Whereas here you have that and that is wide open. So this at least gives you a little bit more visual obscurity right off the bat. How you lay out restoration matters, right? Landscape level, we have to talk about landscape level management. And you look at the configuration of habitat that you're creating. It is easier to make things simple. It is quicker, right, to get things installed. But when you look at basically this is going to be a lot quicker to get planted. If you want to, mostly because there's not a lot of thinking involved in terms of where trees are going or shrubs are going. If you want to try to add some complexity and diversity on a scale of what you're planting and where to more mimic what was probably going on there, then you can. But the amount of planning and execution it takes to get this on the ground gets complicated. However, if you really want to do it right, you're going to really complicate things in terms of trying to get things on the ground. This is probably the most similar to a natural habitat in terms of complexity, species distribution, where things are growing, as opposed to what looks more like agriculture or just get things growing. This is going to have better, it's going to provide more benefit to wildlife species, both short-term and long-term, just because it mimics natural habitat a lot better. Questions on that? Many ways coming up with species to plant, especially in terms of forest restoration, you're going to follow the location that you're restoring. So what species are present in that area that you're already working on? And as I mentioned, if you're in the east, you're going to deal with upland forests. So you're looking at things like your oak species are going to be white oak, black oak, you got shagbark, hickory, and so on. How that may vary in terms of bottomland, you can look at, there's still a few species of oak. They're different oak species. They're much more water tolerant because bottomland forests generally flood a lot more. So their hydrology is such that it's a wetter soil. So you're going to get species that are going to deal with that a little bit better. All right, so you start seeing things like bald cypress, river birch, which you'd never really see in an upland forest unless they're confused, or in a wetland. Which does not happen much. Basically, follow what should be there and try to get it going. So the question then becomes, we've sunk a ton of money into restoration, mine restoration specifically. Is it successful from a wildlife standpoint? Well, it depends. If you think about in terms of wildlife management, mining and mine activity is a major disturbance event. Generally in an area that was forested. Now, what happens when they're done is the creation of, currently, it's the creation of a lot of early successional habitat. Grasslands, young forests, unfortunately, they're filled with a lot of invasives. Some of those invasives, though, wildlife tolerate quite well. Bottom olive, brought in by wildlife biologists because of its wildlife value 7 decades ago, until we learned it takes over. Wildlife does really well with it, though. Good cover, food, so on. So the species that we see succeeding in restoration events short term are early successional species. And there are areas that do quite well. In many ways, species like bobwhite, it's a last stronghold for them in the state. There's more bobwhite in forested minelands than there is in grasslands in the rest of the state, which is where they should be. And it's all because that's where all the young habitat is. Other species like songbirds, dick thistles, which are also grassland species, are all present on those minelands. So if you can do a little bit of work and restoration, although a little bit costs a lot, it can have quite a good benefit to your species of several species, your young habitat species. Or species that do well in openings. So, right, we've got a ton of elk. It's the wrong species of elk, but that's okay, because if it was the eastern elk, they would want chestnuts and forests and live in the forest and not in the grassland. So we brought in western elk, and they like openings. So, so in some ways, yes. In other ways, especially as we look towards this transitioning to older forests, we're losing that young habitat. What we're left with is not good forest habitat. We're left with a lot of invasive species. Yeah.
So is it a slow process that trying to word it? Do animals come in slowly or is it just like instant as soon as it's suitable? Because I'm imagining if you have a reclaimed mine that for years has been clear of wildlife and has human activity, you're going to have multiple generations that know to avoid that area.
So I think you're thinking long-term with no to avoid the area. That's giving them a little more credit than they deserve. Many times what we are thinking about comes into play with the metapopulation dynamics and animal dispersal. And what is their ability to disperse? Where is that population relevant relative to the habitat you created in terms of distance? And how does that balance out with dispersal ability? So animals that, especially animals that migrate, tend to respond really quickly to habitat because they're going across vast areas and searching for habitat. So they're the easiest species to, basically they're the quickest species to find, and they're colonized. Other species, you know, bobwhite quail, their natural history makes it such that they tend to disperse long distances and have to find young habitat on a regular basis. When they're evolving, it's not like early successional habitat was everywhere. It's patchy in nature. It's going to pop up and go away. So they have to have a mechanism where they're traveling large distances to find that good habitat. So they will find it if they're nearby. And by nearby, I think, so I had a friend that did bobwhite metapopulation genetics. 30 miles is feasible for them to travel and find habitat. So if you think about, is there a population of young habitat that has bobwhites within 30 miles of where you're working? Probably. So it just depends. Depends on the species. Now, things like amphibians and reptiles don't tend to have that ability as much. They tend to be smaller. They're going to be much more tied to things like water resources, especially for amphibians. So how they get there, it's a little hard. Travel on the feet of ducks with eggs, like fish. So, okay. All right, we're almost done, I guess. So shifting from restoration to problems associated with managing parks and refuges. They're in general complicated, mostly due to red tape, bureaucracy, and other concerns, human-related concerns. And overall, the things you have to think about when you're managing a refuge, managing a park, especially one that is open to the public, that may be traveling to utilize the park for wildlife viewing, outdoor recreation, you have to be thinking about, if you're the manager, you have to be thinking about the tolerance of wildlife species you have of humans and vice versa. And how then do you deal with providing a balance to allow outdoor recreation, wildlife viewing, so on. And yet, if you have species of concern that are protected within the refuge that do not have a high tolerance of humans, how do you buffer them from those activities? Because the vast majority of folks don't have the knowledge that their activities are impacting wildlife. What do you think their concern is related to?
So I'm gonna post a science figure out.
Yes, yes, it is. It is about their enjoyment and achieving why they were there. Why did they come to the park? If it's to see a wildlife species, then that is their number one focus, and they don't care. I shouldn't say they don't care. A lot of folks don't think about that the fact that their presence or activities can negatively impact that species or other species. There is also the idea that you need to be thinking about is there are charismatic species that everyone cares about, and then there are those that are not thought of at all. If you are tasked with the management of a park for wildlife, you have to be concerned about every species that's there, right? So it is making sure that the resource is present for this generation and the next. And that includes snakes that may not be viewed well by the general public, but may commonly be found in areas that the public use. How do you then save copperheads in the Red River Gorge from hikers? Hard. There's also the idea that if you are dealing with a charismatic species, how do you restrain the public from causing a problem for themselves or for that animal? And that, selfies, Instagram posts, social media has actually created its own beast that we are trying to understand how to deal with. This is a very common occurrence in many parks when a moose, bear, wolf, depending on where you are, is visible. Buffalo, elk, so on.
So what's happening with the acorn sheep in Colorado?
And sometimes, it's species you wouldn't think about. Where in my state, we're obsessed with groundhogs for some odd reason, but only one specific groundhog. There's only one that matters. That's the charismatic one. All other groundhogs can go away. So if you've never been to Puxatawny, you should go, by the way. It's a pretty fun experience, especially if you like polka music. There are also opportunities to engage the public in many ways. Use them for their interest, right? So they're there, they want to be involved, see species, engage with the park in some way, shape, or form. It opens doors to potentially help you in management, right? So think citizen science programs, citizen science projects. eBird is a great example for not just in a park, but overall collection of bird data through the entire world. There are situations, especially things like this fish ladder is present and they use it. It's in the visitor center, it's open access, but people will sit there and collect data on fish, the biologists, on how many fish are going through the fish ladder. Gives them an idea about the spawn. What they found out is you can get other people that are sitting there to count fish for you and input the data, and you don't have to have someone sitting there counting fish. So you can get, and people love it. They like to engage in data collection when they understand what it's for, especially when it's something they would be doing anyway, standing there looking at fish. So there's opportunities there outside of just the normal engagement with wildlife viewing. Things like Project Feeder Watch is another great example. Geez. Is anyone participating in any citizen science projects? iNaturalist is one. Yeah. So you can quickly get involved and help out. Now, the complications that exist, unfortunately, whenever you're dealing with parks, especially national parks, Forest Service properties, wilderness areas, or you have restricted management ability. So you may have areas that are closed to hunting and maybe open very large areas, think Yellowstone, that is closed to hunting, and yet ample habitat that allows many of the herbivore populations to spike. So this is the elk population for Yellowstone. And you can see it growing. The story associated with this and the landscape of fear, right? So the big problem was they recognized that elk were having a negative impact on the ecosystem, so they don't allow hunting. They now have some restricted harvest. But how do you deal with that? And instead of going the route of hunting, they looked at natural predation, and now we have wolves, right? And you can see the response of the population to that. So they went a different route than normal, right? So if we were talking about Kentucky and dealing with an overpopulation of deer, we just let more people shoot more deer. That's not possible, so you have to get creative. Same holds true for many other species, not just large herbivores like elk and deer. You may get into problems with carnivores, bears. Grizzly bears is a big topic right now. How do you deal with grizzly bears? The idea that wolves are also now on the refuge and source populations for other conflict like livestock. So you have to get creative. This is one, if you're anywhere in the territory of bears, bear management in parks is a huge issue. Twofold. One, people will try to feed bears on a regular basis. They're charismatic. They respond very quickly to humans if they get a reward. Unfortunately, because they learn to associate people with food, it opens the door to the second problem. And the second problem is that bears are still predators and will potentially attack humans. There was just, I think, a girl that was attacked in the Great Smokies this past late summer while she was sleeping by a young male. There's history of bears killing hikers. That can happen regardless of whether they're fed or not, right? So the idea of potentially getting between mom and cub is an issue, but we see a lot more issues with bears that are fed by humans, come into contact with humans regularly, put themselves in position to have a problem. So dealing with bears in that setting may involve non-lethal tactics, beanbags, screamers, where you're shooting and scaring the bear, trying to get a negative association instead of a positive association. It also heavily involves human education. Trying to change human behavior is sometimes easier than wildlife. Sometimes we're resistant to change. However, people change a lot quicker when someone just gets attacked by a bear in the area. So it's just hard. There's also that entire component of charismatic animals. And one of the quickest ways to teach a bear to avoid humans is actually through hunting. We have, where I'm from, Pennsylvania, a large bear population. It's estimated somewhere around 20,000. We don't have a ton of bear issues, especially compared to like Kentucky that has 350 bears and like 70 bears are under nuisance. It's like a quarter of the population. We have a very heavy bear hunting season in terms of pressure, and that helps keep bears away from all the camping and camps because they have that negative association. Not possible in parks a lot. Other complications, vegetation management. Many areas can't use herbicides or other normal tools that we would commonly implement to change habitat or control invasives. Yeah.
Does the negative association cause them to be more aggressive towards humans at all?
No, usually the response for a bear is still to flee. The aggressive component comes in with the mothering nature and protecting the young. Yeah, it's not, there's not necessarily an aggressive interaction there. Usually they still think they're out. They're still, yeah. they're going the other way. And then finally, one of the other tools that can be complicated, especially if you're managing parks or refuges in an urban suburban setting, is fire, even though it's a tool that is sometimes really needed, especially if you're doing management with grasslands. Neighbors don't like smoke coming through their windows. They're really against it, actually. So it can complicate how you get that habitat prescription on the ground if no one wants you to burn because they don't want smoke in their house. Can you blame them? Not really. I don't like smoke in my house either, but you know, it's a balancing act. How do you achieve those management goals if you can't use certain tools? Especially since the second tool past fire is herbicides. So you may have both your tools taken off. Okay, so that's all I got for the class. We're done. You have lab today, and keep to your traditional groups to spread out the number of folks in the space. And other than that, I think Sarah's got Thursday set up for your review open lab. And if you have any questions, just let us know.